Thanks a lot for having me today. My name is Julian. I'm part of Recorded Future's threat research team, where I mostly focus on detection of malicious infrastructure with a focus on mercenary spyware and also cybercrime. And today I'm going to talk about TAG 124, which is a threat actor that is behind a TDS that has become increasingly popular in the last couple of months. But before I jump into the threat actor, I'll give you a very brief primer on TDS in more general terms. So for those of you who are not that familiar with it, TDS are essentially traffic distribution systems that are redirecting victim traffic to malicious content based on various different factors, such as, for example, location, user behavior, and many others. They've been around for a lot of time, essentially, and it was actually hard to figure out when the first one popped up, and there are new ones popping up on a regular basis, such as, for example, the one by TAG 124. There are malicious ones, but there are also benign ones, but I put benign into quotes because most of the benign ones are also abused in some form, like Kitero, for example. They have a lot of advantages. So they are targeted, for example, so actors, they can decide who they want to infect, particularly interesting for ransomware groups, for example. They're scalable, and you will see what I mean by that later on, by basically just adding more infrastructure to it to essentially increase the funnel size of such a network. They're flexible, and we'll also talk about this later on, because you can determine what kind of follow-on lure you want to use for your TDS. And then last but not least, they're also pretty evasive, because essentially the first part of it is a legitimate infrastructure, so few people expect it to be malicious, in most cases at least. So having said that, now let's dive a little bit into TAG 124. So the actor is essentially behind a network that is also known in the industry as Land Update 808, KongTuke, or Chaya 002. It was first observed in the beginning of 2024 and has since then essentially steadily expanded its user base. It operates a vast network of thousands of compromised WordPress sites alongside actor-controlled infrastructure. We'll dive into this in a second. And then overall, there's very limited information on TAG 124. And the reason for that is, for one, because of the way they set up their infrastructure through compromised infrastructure, services that use crypto, for example, for their payment, and also everything that is essentially exposed to the internet is not really giving a lot of clues of who they might be. And in addition to that, we have not identified where they're actually selling their service, but we think they do because of the number of actors that are using the network. So to give you an idea of how active that has been, the first stage payload server is a good approximation of it, and that has been relatively stable over the last month, as you can see, maybe with a slight downward trend, possibly due to increased focus on it and detection. However, based on that, it's also very hard to extrapolate to the actual number of WordPress sites, because the same delivery servers are used across hundreds, if not thousands, of different WordPress sites at the same time, and then rotated on an ongoing basis. So, to give you some idea of a high-level view of the infection chain, I hope you can see it actually. Everything starts with the victim visiting a compromised WordPress site. The WordPress sites then include an embedded script tag, which includes a URL to a first stage TAG 124 server. The server then calls an externally hosted JavaScript, and that JavaScript essentially involves code to determine what to do next, essentially. So if it passes the conditional logic, it will provide you with a follow-on lure, such as, for example, fake browsers or click-fix, and we'll talk about this in a second. If you don't pass, you will get an error message on empty page, but that has changed over time a little bit. So let's have a look at stage one, the compromised WordPress site. So overall, as I mentioned, there are thousands of them. It's hard to determine how many there are in actual terms, but at least we've identified thousands of them. We haven't really seen any specific focus on specific sectors or geography, so we assume that they're likely compromising those domains opportunistically. One thing that is interesting is that some sites, they remain infected for essentially forever, so they stay part of the network forever, and then others they relatively quickly realize that they're part of it and then remove basically the infection from their sites. What's also interesting, we did an analysis of the WordPress sites, and most of them are actually up to date when it comes to the WordPress core. And that kind of raised the question of how they are actually getting infected. There are three different ways that we came up with, in addition to a couple of others, but they seem to be likely. So the first one is obviously because the WordPress sites are up to date. It might be just a plugin exploitation, and that would make sense because most of the WordPress sites that we see that are compromised were compromised via vulnerable plugins. However, we did not really see any pattern, so we can't really say whether there's a specific plugin, for example, that they've been extensively compromised. The second hypothesis is for a lot of the WordPress sites, we actually saw leaked admin credentials that were stolen by info stealers such as Luma, Vidar, and many others. And so it is a possibility, at least for cases where TAG 124 has an interest to, for example, high traffic websites, that they purchase these accesses and then maintain persistent access. And then last but not least, what's also interesting is that we observed a pretty large network of domains that were connected to the network, but we didn't really know what they were used for. One thing that we saw, however, is that those domains, they impersonated WordPress engine websites. And at some point, we also saw some login panels popping up on those sites. And so we assumed that they might use them for spear phishing, but then at the same time, we haven't really identified any full infection chain or any phishing kit or something linked to those. One little thought experiment. So I was wondering how likely is it actually that you come across a TAG 124 compromised domain if you just visit the internet. And based on the estimates and the public reports that I could find, there is a 1% chance that you stumble across a vulnerable WordPress site if you just take a random page view. And now if you multiply that with the number of internet users, the number of pages that the normal internet user uses, and then even if you take into account that TAG 104 likely just compromised a very small proportion of those vulnerable WordPress sites, the number actually accumulates relatively quickly. And so it really shows that there is a substantial traffic towards this TDS. Regarding the Stage 2 of this TDS, it's essentially consisting of 4 little scripts. So the first script is setting a cookie to prevent bots and researchers from visiting. So if you want to research it, you have to make sure that you remove the cookie whenever you start a try. The second script then is collecting various different information pieces such as operating system, location, IP, and so on, and interestingly makes use of Cloudflare services to get the location, and then encodes the data, sends it to the C2 to a specific endpoint that was stable at the beginning, so you could just use the PHP file name to parse all the known WordPress sites. You would basically identify all the compromised sites, but then at some point, I think right after we published on it, they actually changed the logic, and so now they randomly generate these PHP file names. So it's not possible to detect them in that way anymore. And then basically the last script checks the response. If it's bigger than 35 bytes, it will lead you to the next stage. If not, it will give you the error page or an NP page. So over time, we have seen a couple of different, stage 3. So at the beginning, it was just fake browsers, and they changed it slightly, likely just to evade detection. And then it's the beginning of 2025, we started seeing them using a lot of click-fix. And most recently, we also saw them using FileFix, which is essentially a subgroup of click-fix, where the victim is essentially asked to paste the code into the address bar of the file explorer instead of the terminal, so it makes it a bit more, let's say, convincing in some way or another. This use of ClickFix, I think that aligns pretty well with the industry trend, and I think at least here at this conference, I think I saw 3 talks already on ClickFix. Aligns pretty well with roughly 500% increase between 2024 and 2025. Reasons, I think, are relatively straightforward. So they are more evasive, more user-convincing, and then also more versatile. So you're not sticking to the same lure again and again, but you can basically create your own lures and have much more flexibility. And interestingly, as our friends from Proofpoint also reported, is that also state-sponsored actors have increasingly started using ClickFix for possibly multiple reasons, maybe because they're just effective, but maybe also because they're helping them to blend in with cybercriminal activity. And yeah, so having said that, now I would like to dive a little bit into the infrastructure setup of TAG 124 that has remained well consistent ever since we essentially started tracking them, and I'll walk you through it. It's a bit convoluted, but everything starts with number 1, so the compromised WordPress sites that I was talking to. They include these embedded script tags, which include the URLs to the TAG 124 controlled payload servers, which we track as tier 1 because they're victim-facing and they're rotated on a continuous basis. Those servers, they check in with something that we track, the central server, which is tier 2, so that is not victim-facing. And we suspect that the central server contains the actual logic of the TDS, so basically determines which follow-on stage different visitors reach. The central server is then administered via SSH port 22 from something that we call the management panel server, which is tier 3, so it's one step behind essentially. And the threat actors themselves, they access the panel on port 9092 TCP and essentially interact with the server there. Then going back to 5, the WordPress sites, they're on the WordPress engines, and those engine servers, essentially, they retrieve new payload URLs from something that we track as the ads panel servers. And those servers, essentially servers that have a specific endpoint that if you query it, you will always get the most recent your payload URL. And so they kind of change the URLs within in the compromised WordPress sites. This server also tracked as tier 1 because it's not really victim-facing. It's just visible from the WordPress engine hosting servers. It's also administered via SSH port 22. And then I think one last thing here to note is, or two things actually. One thing, the panel is only accessible if you have a specific user ID. Without the user ID, you can't access the panel. And you also see that it's really simplistic. So the only thing that you see on the panel is actually a password field, nothing else. So it's essentially just a couple of characters long. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention, that there's also a backup server that the management panel server talks via a high UDP port. One high-level remark on this is that everything that you can see on the left side from this here is often hosted or somewhere in the target countries, if you so will. And then everything on the right side, unsurprisingly, is somewhere where it's rather out of reach for law enforcement in other countries. So having said that, there is a large group of different actors that make use or have made use of TAG 124 in the past. It's pretty diverse, so you see state-aligned groups, you see cybercriminal actors, and so on and so forth. It's not comprehensive, it's just a selection, and it's also not saying that they're all using it all the time, but they're often just using it for a short period of time, then stop using it, or others just use it with different breaks in it, and so on and so forth. But there was one group, and I highlighted it, that stood out, that was Interlock ransomware, and by extension also Rhysida, because they overlap in some ways. And I wanted to dive a little bit more into that. Before I dive into the reason why we thought that there might be a special connection between the two, some background on Interlock ransomware. So Interlock ransomware is a ransomware group that has become increasingly active in the last couple of months. It has been active since September 2024, focused on legal, health, critical infrastructure, and some other sectors. They, as I said, overlap or are possibly linked to Rhysida in some way, and there's a lot of good, or not a lot, but a little bit of a good public reporting on the overlap and why they might be the same or overlapping at least. And then they're also highly likely Russia-based. And if you look at the picture in the left bottom, you see a pattern of life analysis of when we observed the threat actors connecting to the panel, and that aligns pretty well with a typical work time in Russia. So, and then maybe last but not least, it's not operating as an affiliate model based on our visibility, so they act on their own. So before I jump into this special connection, I wanted to also briefly walk you through a typical infection chain of Interlock using tag 124. So again, it starts with the victim visiting a tag 124 compromised site. That then basically asks them to do the lure, essentially. That leads to a Windows shortcut, runs the PowerShell, that runs another PowerShell, that loads and runs a PHP interpreter, that then executes a PHP backdoor, and at least what we've seen, that then kind of leads to a interlock rat. And interestingly, the interlock rat has 3 different C2s in it across 3 different ASNs, likely as a way to increase their resilience. And the C2s then connect to the admin panel, which is then also administered by the interlock rat or interlock threat actors. And that's exactly where we got the pattern of life analysis from. So that's when we saw them connecting to the panel. So coming back to this suspected special connection between the two, so what did we observe? So we observed one organization early 2024 that was compromised by tag 124. And then 3 days later, we saw the same organization talking to a interlock rat C2 server. And then 10 days later, the same organization popped up on a interlock data leak site. The question is, could this just be coincidence? Of course it could. I mean, a lot of different groups hack the same organizations, and I would also argue that many cases, if an organization is hacked by one, they are often also more prone to be hacked by others because they might have some security vulnerabilities. And also one other thing to note here is that hacking a WordPress site is not the same as hacking the corporate network of an organization, but they can go hand in hand because they can be, for example, the precursor of the other or a side product of the other. So the only thing that stood out to us is that the same thing happened at least 3 times in a very short period of time, and that made it a bit more suspicious, so we looked a little bit deeper into it. And we also, in addition to the actual victim overlap, we also found out that some of the interlock servers, they became tag 124 servers in a very short period of time, and also the other way around. So some of the the interlock servers became tag 124 servers. So in both ways, essentially. So what does that mean? Well, I'm afraid that I won't be able to provide you a full answer. I think there were more questions in the end of the day. We just observed those interesting correlations and came up with a couple of possible explanations. So first of all, there is the possibility that it's just a coincidence. We think that's rather unlikely without any other explanatory factor, because it's not just the fact that it happened, but also the fact that it happened in a very short time period. The second possible explanation is that they're actually the same group, just with 2 different business models. For that, I would say it is possible, of course, but we don't have evidence for it at all. And one thing to note here, and that I think is interesting, is that Interlock is the only ransomware group that we've seen, in addition to Rhysida, and those are kind of the overlapping with each other, that have been seen working together with tag 124. Third explanation is they might just have a closer collaboration than others. I think that could definitely make sense. I mean, if you look at the threat intelligence community as well, there are some organizations that just have a better connection or a working relationship. So the same could apply to them as well. Shared services, such as, for example, initial access brokers, is another thing that we pursue. We didn't really found any evidence for it, but it's a possibility. And last but not least, I think another possibility is that they just have staff overlap, which kind of would make sense, because if you think of how cybercriminal actors often operate, that they operate with their cyber persona, why not just work for 2 groups at the same time? However, as I mentioned, still a lot of open questions, and that leads us to the conclusion, actually. So first thing that I wanted to say, there are still a lot of open questions because of the ongoing investigation. Some of the fundamental questions that we still have is, where is it actually being advertised? We're pretty certain that it is, but we couldn't really pinpoint to where that is the case. We also wonder how effective it is, particularly in comparison to other TDSs. And then last but not least, and I think that goes hand in hand with the others, is who's behind it, and also whether there is this connection or not. And I think there's still some open things to research, essentially. Some of the analytical difficulties that we found or find is that we suspect that if it is advertised, it's likely a closed circle, and that's something that we haven't identified. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, it's highly anonymous, so not just from the fact that it's using compromised infrastructure and then hosting providers that accept anonymous payment and so on, but also some of the infrastructure is based in some locations where we have less visibility into. And then also if you look at, for example, the exposed things, such as, for example, the panel, it doesn't really give you any further thing from which you can pivot to. What to expect, and then I'll conclude, we can expect, as we see, that the network continuously adapts, and it is succeeding. It has a lot of partners, apparently, in the network of cybercriminals. We suspect it continuously changes infrastructure, and we do see, I think that was just a couple of weeks ago, actually, that they even started also having new customers using that network. Having said that, thank you very much for listening.